Hello, welcome back. Continuing on with our discussions about World War II here. And in the previous lesson, we were discussing those years from 1939 to 1942, that first half of the Second World War, that half of the war that the Axis powers of Italy, Germany, and Japan were really on a roll. They were knocking over country after country, adding more territory to the already large amounts of territory that they had conquered. But it will be in 1942 that the tide begins to turn, that the Allies are finally able to get onto some level footing and really start to push back and drive the Axis powers back in this conflict. So this is the second half of World War II here. And our objectives today, we want to identify the major events of World War II. We're continuing that. We're going to talk about, again, those events from 1942, really after the attack on Pearl Harbor, all the way up through the end of the war with the surrender of Italy, Germany, and Japan. And then talk a little bit about obviously then what brings about the defeat of Nazi Germany in Europe and Imperial Japan in Asia. But where we want to pick up, though, is just a quick reminder. By the end of 1941, with the United States now being brought into that war after the attack on Pearl Harbor by Japan, the Allied powers are as follows. You have the big three, Great Britain being led by Winston Churchill, who you can see right here, the Soviet Union led by Joseph Stalin, which you can see right here, and then Franklin Roosevelt leading the United States, and you can see him right here. And then on the opposing side, the Axis power side, you have Nazi Germany led by Adolf Hitler, Fascist Italy led by Benito Mussolini, and then Imperial Japan led by Hideki Tojo. And if we take a look here at what's been going on in Europe between 1939 and 1941, again, this is the height of Axis power around the world. Those opening years of the war were the years in which Germany and Italy and Europe really expanded their power, were really able to knock a lot of countries, catch a lot of countries off guard, and topple a lot of them. Same is happening in Japan during this time as well. But you can see here the extent to which the Germans were able to conquer much of mainland Europe during that time, 1939 to 1941. But in 1941, toward the tail end of 1941, two really key events happened that we talk about in that previous lesson, one being Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union, the other one being the Japanese attack on the naval base of Pearl Harbor at the island of Hawaii. But let's talk a little bit about that mistake in Europe, Hitler and the Nazis invading the Soviet Union. This was a massive, massive undertaking, and one that really, like I've said numerous times now already, is going to be the critical key turning point in the war against Nazi Germany. This is when the Germans stop winning the war and start losing the war. And they were, if you look back on this map, actually quite successful, pushing far into the Soviet Union, all the way to the gates of Moscow, the gates of Leningrad, and then also the gates of this city right here, Stalingrad, which is what we're going to talk about right now. The Battle of Stalingrad. This was a key pivotal event. This was the moment, the battle, when you can say this was the moment when the Germans stopped winning the war. This is the moment when the Nazis in Europe started losing World War II. And Stalingrad, the city of Stalingrad, was an important city for a couple of key reasons. One, it was an important industrial city in the Soviet Union. It is a city in which they were able to build a lot of the weapons they needed to carry out this conflict against the Nazis. And so Germany felt like if they could take Stalingrad, they can put a lot of those factories and industries out of commission, thus hurting the Soviets' ability to continue on with the war. And then also it would be a psychological win for the Germans as well. Stalingrad, the city, is named after its leader, Joseph Stalin. So being able to take out his city, the city that bears his name, the Germans thought would be a major blow to the psyche of the Soviets and contribute to their demoralization, their demise, their inability to continue on with this conflict against the Germans in the East. Okay, and this was a massive undertaking starting in August of 1942, so about a year after the Germans invaded the Soviet Union is when they decide to lay siege to the city of Stalingrad. It lasts from August 1942 all the way until February of 1943. There will be over 2 million troops involved in this conflict. That's both Nazi troops and Soviet troops. And as a result, you are also going to see hundreds of thousands of people, millions of casualties in this city, not just troops and casualties, but also civilian casualties as well, the citizens of Stalingrad. And this is going to be, Stalingrad's a pretty important city, so it's going to be a lot of urban warfare, street to street, house to house, building to building style warfare, which was somewhat different than what the Germans had been doing as they marched east into the Soviet Union. So you can see some of the images here of that urban city warfare that took place in the city of Stalingrad. By February of 1943, though, the Germans would lose and would have to basically give up their dreams, their plans of taking out this important industrial city within the Soviet Union. It's going to be a major victory for the Russians, for the Soviets. And again, it's really going to mark that point in the war in Europe when the Germans begin to start to lose this conflict. And as we'll see throughout our studies of World War II, it was really the war in the East against the Germans and the Soviets where World War II in Europe was won. Okay, yes, the Americans were involved. Yes, the British were involved. We're going to talk about D-Day and all that good stuff. But really, the war against Germany was won by the Soviets. They're the ones that did the bulk of the fighting against the Germans, lost the bulk of the lives in the fighting against Germany, and really without the efforts of the Soviets in the East, defending their cities and then driving the Germans back into Western Europe and into Germany, who knows how successful the Americans and the British would have been in their attack on Normandy that we'll talk about here in just a few slides. Now, after this major victory by the Soviets, the Allied leaders, the Big Three, as they were like to be called, as they're often called the Big Three, Stalin, Roosevelt, Churchill. Okay, the Big Three, they get together in the first of three conferences. This is the Tehran Conference. It's going to be hosted in the Soviet embassy in Tehran, which is in the present-day country of Iran. And at this meeting, which took place in November and December of 1943, so shortly after the Soviet victory against Nazi Germany and Stalingrad, they're going to meet to try and discuss how this war is going to play out. How they can kind of come together, cooperate, combine their forces, and plan strategically for defeating Germany and Italy in Europe during World War II. And one of the big agreements that came out of the Tehran Conference was that the Soviets would continue to drive into Germany from the east after defeating them at the Battle of Stalingrad. And then the Americans and the British agreed to open up a Western front to kind of relieve some of the pressure on the Soviet Union and the fighting that they're doing in Eastern Europe. So this is where the Big Three agree kind of to what they're going to do to take out Germany. We'll talk about this Western Front that the Americans and the British open up in just a moment. Actually, we'll do it right now. So D-Day, this is that Western Front that the Americans and the British promised the Soviets that they would open up against the Germans at the Tehran Conference. This D-Day is Takes place in summer, June 6, 1944. It's going to be a combined American, British, and Canadian invasion of Nazi occupied France. So you can see England over here, Great Britain, the United Kingdom, just across the English Channel. You can see France right here. France at this point, if you think back to our previous lesson, right, the French were defeated by the Germans pretty early in World War II, and this northern portion, the coastal portion of France, was under Nazi occupation, and the Americans and the British and the Canadians and even the Australians and soldiers from New Zealand, really soldiers from throughout the British Empire, are going to try and land in France to begin that Western Front, to open up a new line of fighting against the Germans in the West. And this is going to be the largest land, air, and sea attack in history. Okay, this is going to be massive. This is unprecedented. Nothing before or since has ever been seen in the history of warfare. Okay. This was a major, major operation to land troops there in France to start taking on the Germans. And you can see in this image here, there were a number of beaches along the Norman coast that the Americans, British, and Canadians landed on to fight the Germans. They all have American names, either from states or cities in Alaska. So you've got Utah, the beaches of Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, and Sword. And you can see where the Americans landed, where the British landed, and where the Canadians landed. And this was a major Allied victory. This is a huge, huge victory for the Allied powers. It gives them a foothold in France, and it opens up that much-needed Western Front. So Germany is now in a position where they have to fight a two-front war, just like in World War I. They've got to fight the Russians or the Soviets in the East, and now they've got to fight the Americans and the British in the West. Okay, so this is the scene then. After the successful attack in Normandy, the Norman landing, the D-Day invasion by the Allied powers, you now have the American and British forces marching toward Germany from the west. You have the Soviet-Russian forces marching toward Germany from the east, and Germany is about to get squeezed. Okay, it's pretty clear now that the war against Germany, the Allies now have the upper hand, and they're going to march in to Germany. There's going to be a few hiccups along the way, but they've at least got that process started. One of those hiccups is going to be the Battle of the Bulge. There's going to be a major German offensive in Western Europe in winter of 1944, 1945, December 1944 to January 1945, as the American and British forces are marching toward Germany, through France, through Belgium, through the Netherlands. You can see here on this red line, this is the front line of fighting. The Germans on this side, the American, British, Canadian forces on the other. And this is really going to be Hitler's last major offensive, his last major attempt to try and snag victory from the jaws of defeat. Okay, it's pretty clear at this point that Germany is on their heels, on the defensive. They're more than likely going to lose the war. So Hitler's going to try and make one last-ditch effort to take on the American, British, Canadian forces in the West, hoping to score a major victory that could, if not turn the war back into Germany's favor, if it couldn't do that, then maybe it could put Germany in a position where they could request a meeting where they could discuss some peace terms that could be favorable to Germany. And it's called the Battle of the Bulge because if you look at this line here, this front line of fighting, when the Germans attacked, they basically brought all their forces into this area here on the map and made one last desperate attempt to push through the line of fighting, and it formed this little bulge where the Germans were able to kind of break through and push the Americans and British and Canadian forces back. It would be a short-lived moment of success for the Germans, and they would eventually, as you can see, have to retreat back into Germany. Again, this is Hitler's last major offensive, their last-ditch effort to try and salvage the war here. It's going to be another major defeat for the Germans, one in just another series of defeats, going all the way back to the Battle of Stalingrad, going all the way back to D-Day, and now the Battle of the Bulge. At this point, it is no longer a question of will Germany be defeated. It is now a question of when will Germany be defeated. It's pretty much a conclusion now that the war is over, that the Americans, the British, the Russians, the Soviets are going to win. It's just a matter of how many more days and months is that going to take, because the Allies now have a clear path into Germany from the west. And keep in mind, too, while this is happening, the Soviets, the Russians in the east, are also marching closer and closer to Germany as well. Okay, so after the Battle of the Bulge, shortly thereafter, the second conference of the Big Three takes place. In February of 1945, in the city of Yalta, which was in the what is today Russia, but at that time it was in the Soviet Union, also a part of the Ukraine here on the Black Sea. The Big Three, Churchill, Roosevelt, Stalin, they get together, and now that they kind of know that the war is over, that the Germans are going to lose, it's just a matter of finishing them off now, they agree to meet to discuss what they're going to do after the war. Okay, what's going to happen after the war? How are they going to put the pieces of Europe back together? What are they going to do to Germany? Well, they agree after the war that Germany will be divided up amongst themselves and will be occupied. The Soviets also agreed to attack Japan, to join the war against Japan in the Pacific and Asia once Germany is defeated, which would really help the Americans. And then they also agreed to and we'll talk more about this in a future lesson, the creation of a new organization to replace the League of Nations called the United Nations. Okay, so at the second big conference of the Big Three at Yalta, they agreed to three things. They agreed to divide up and occupy Germany after the war. The Soviets agreed to join the war against Japan once Germany is finally defeated. And then they all three agreed to this creation of a new international organization to replace the League of Nations, which will be called the United Nations, that we'll talk about more in some upcoming lessons. All right. Now the actual final part of the war in Europe, the fall of Berlin itself. In April 1945, the Soviet Union, after several years of just knockdown, drag out fighting with the Nazis, with the Germans in the east, finally enter the city of Berlin and capture the city of Berlin in April of 1945. You can see some of the images here. There's the German Reichstag. That's their Capitol building there in Berlin. It's kind of a bombed out building at this point. You can see some of these Soviet tanks rolling through the city of Berlin. And then one of the iconic photos from World War II, a little bit of colorization added here for effect. But you've got the image here, the iconic image of the Russian soldier here raising the Soviet flag over the Reichstag in Berlin, marking the military defeat of Nazi Germany. Okay. During this time in April, as the Soviets are approaching, closer and closer to where Hitler is holed up here in Berlin in his little bunker. On April 8th, 1945, Hitler will take his own life. And then about a month later, those who are left in charge of Germany will formally surrender, ending the war in Europe in May of 1945. Okay, so it's going to be April of 45 when the Soviets enter Berlin and capture the city, April 8th when Hitler takes his own life, and then about a month later when the formal surrender of Germany takes place, thus ending the war against the Nazis in Europe. So at this point, the war in Europe is now over, and the Allies can turn their attention to the war in the Pacific, the war in Asia against Imperial Japan. And that's where we're going to go now and revisit some of the big events in that theater of war in the Pacific, the Battle of Midway. Okay, this could be June of 1942. Okay, this is analogous to the Battle of Stalingrad in Europe in coincidentally, also 1942. That was the major turning point in the war in Europe. Well, the Battle of Midway in June of 1942 is going to be the major turning point in the war against the Japanese in the Pacific. This is the first major U.S. victory over Japan, and surprisingly, it came pretty quickly after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December of 1941. So, barely right about 6 months after the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, the Americans were able to score their first major victory against Japan at the Battle of Midway. This was actually supposed to be a surprise Japanese attack on the Americans. The Americans, though, had broken the Japanese communication code, and they actually knew that the Japanese were planning this attack. And so the United States was actually able to launch their own little preemptive surprise attack, a surprise attack to their surprise attack. And it caught Japan completely off guard. And as a result, it ended up being a devastating blow to the Japanese Navy, really crippling their ability to patrol the Pacific and protect the islands surrounding Japan. Okay, this is going to be that turning point in the war. This is that moment when the Japanese go from being on the offensive to now being on the defensive. This is that moment where the Japanese stop winning the war in the Pacific and they begin to lose the war in the Pacific. And on a little side note here, this conflict, this Battle of Midway, the first time in history that two navies fought each other without actually seeing one another. They couldn't actually see the ships. This was mainly fought among the fighter planes being launched by the various aircraft carriers. Possessed by both sides. So this could be a major United States victory in the war against Japan and a major turning point in that war in June of 1942, the Battle of Midway. And you can see some of the images here, the aircraft carriers loaded with planes, and then the fighting that was taking place. Again, mainly fighting between the two navies using their fighter aircraft. You can see the bombs exploding in the sky, ships getting hit, and ships being sunk there at the Battle of Midway. All right, so the United States is taking the offensive in the Pacific theater of war. They're starting to drive toward Japan. Things are a bit different in the Pacific, though, because it's not a land battle or a land war the way that the war in Europe against Nazi Germany was. This is a battle being fought out over the vast expanses of the Pacific Ocean, and one individual, a fairly important figure in the war here in the Pacific, is General Douglas MacArthur, the U.S. General Douglas MacArthur. You can see him right here. And he came up with this idea, this strategy to defeat Japan, known as island hopping. Okay, the idea here is you've got a number of small islands here in the South Pacific. And his idea was to basically hop from island to island all the way to the main island of Japan. Okay, now they were not going to hop and take over every island. Part of this plan was skipping over those islands that were most heavily defended by the Japanese, skipping over them to the more lightly defended islands, thus cutting off some of those other islands from the Japanese homeland, and also helping the United States get closer and closer so they can use some of these islands closer to Japan to start launching attacks on the main island of Japan, primarily bombing raids using the Army Air Force to start bombing some of the cities of Japan, but also claim some of the islands closer to Japan that could then be used in the event that the Americans might need to actually invade Japan, much like they had to invade Europe there on the beaches of Normandy in France. Okay, but this idea of island hopping, this strategy conceived by Douglas MacArthur to march the Americans closer and closer to the home island of Japan. All right. Also during this time, we need to talk about the Manhattan Project, which was a top secret American project to develop the very first atomic bomb. This was started by President Roosevelt. He had received a letter from one of the most famous scientists of all time, right? Albert Einstein had sent President Roosevelt a letter basically saying that word on the street is that the Germans were working on developing a new weapon, a new kind of bomb that would be more destructive than any weapon, any bomb ever created in human history. And it involved the splitting of the atom to unleash this massive power, this massive destructive power. And he warned Roosevelt that the Germans were working on this, or at least people thought the Germans were working on this. And if the Germans got this, it could be a major game changer. And if this technology were in the wrong hands, who knows what would happen, all kinds of bad things. So spooked by that or scared by that, Roosevelt decided to create a project here in the United States to try and develop the first atomic bomb, to try and beat the Germans in that race to develop the first atomic weapon. And that project is called the Manhattan Project. It's going to be led by this guy right here, Dr. Robert Oppenheimer, a scientist who will be in charge of the project. And it's going to be a massive multi-year project. It's going to involve research sites and research labs throughout the United States and the state of Washington, Tennessee, Chicago, Illinois, and also where much of the testing would be conducted in the deserts of New Mexico. And on July 16th, 1945, the United States wins the race to develop the world's first atomic bomb when the Americans successfully detonated the very first nuclear weapon or atomic weapon in the deserts of New Mexico at 5:30 in the morning on July 16th, 1945. The Americans successfully detonate the first atomic bomb, bringing the world into a whole new era of warfare. Also around this time, the third and final major conference of the big three Allied powers, the British, the Americans, and the Soviets, takes place in Germany, in Potsdam, just a couple months after the surrender of Germany. And at the Potsdam Conference, there's going to be a couple new faces here, because you will notice that Winston Churchill is not present, nor is Franklin Roosevelt, just Joseph Stalin. He is the only original member of the Big Three present at the Potsdam Conference. And the reason why is because in the summer, late spring, actually, of 1945, April, I believe, of 1945, in the same month that Hitler took his own life, President Roosevelt died in office, and his vice president, Harry Truman, will succeed him to become president. And then also in England and Great Britain, once the war against Germany ended, the British people voted Winston Churchill out of office and replaced him with this person right here, Prime Minister Clement Attlee, who would take over for Winston Churchill, the British thinking that he would be a better peacetime prime minister than Churchill, who was a very effective wartime prime minister. And at this conference in Potsdam, Germany, the Allied powers issue the Potsdam Declaration, in which they call for the complete and unconditional surrender of Japan, and warn that if Japan did not surrender unconditionally, that Japan would face utter destruction. Okay, and while the British and the Soviets might not exactly have known what that meant, certainly at this point, Truman knew that the Americans had the atomic bomb that they could use and will use against the Japanese. So when he's talking about facing utter destruction, you got to think that that's part of what he meant in expressing those words. Now, nobody really knows if the British at this point knew if the Americans had the weapon or not. We now know that certainly the Soviets knew that they had spies in the United States during this time, and the Soviets knew that the Americans had this weapon, but the British probably did not, and certainly the Japanese did not. But the Potsdam Declaration, Japan needs to surrender or face utter destruction. And the form of that utter destruction would come about a month later in August of 1945 when the United States, on the orders of President Truman, dropped not one but two atomic bombs on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan. And you can see here, this is the island of Japan. Or the islands that make up Japan. And you can see where the city of Hiroshima is located, where the city of Nagasaki is located, and then the dates on which the two cities were attacked using these atomic weapons. You can see the island where the Americans staged this attack, the first bomb being dropped on August 6th, 1945. The plane that carried it was called the Enola Gay. And then the second bomb, 3 days later on August 9th, the plane that carried it was called Boxcar. Okay, the two infamous planes in the history of warfare, both of them delivering the atomic weapons that would annihilate the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. You can kind of see here, just to give you a sense of what kind of destruction these weapons can create. You can see some of the stats here on the city of Hiroshima. The bombing, the ground temperatures as a result of the bomb, the kinds of winds that the bomb created, the hurricane force winds created by the bomb, the amount of energy released, the amount of buildings destroyed, the amount of people killed instantly, the number of people who died by the end of 1945 due to some of the lingering effects of radiation on the population, and then just in total, the total number of dead due to this bomb. And yeah, it's probably that might even be a low number. Might even be a little bit higher than that when the final death toll is counted. You can see some of the images here of I believe this is Hiroshima after the bomb had been dropped. The city is completely leveled, right? Just completely gone. Just just to help you visualize just the sheer destructive power of these kinds of weapons. Okay. And as a result of that, after the second bombing on the 9th of August, a few days later on August 15th, the Japanese surrender. And then a month later in September, they signed the formal treaty ending the war in the Pacific. So the war is finally over. World War II is in the books. The Allies have, at the cost of millions of lives and billions of dollars, have finally defeated the Axis powers, Germany and Italy first in Europe in May of 1945, and then Japan last in late summer, early fall, August and September of 1945. So there you go. Those are the major events of the war, broken up over two presentations. If you have any questions, as always, feel free to contact me, email me, or message me through Parent Square or It's Learning or Google Classroom, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Thanks for watching.